30 years ago you didn't really think about super, and I was lucky in that I was forced to.
I've got a neighbour who was an accountant and he loved his work and worked long hours, and he retired one day and he just fell apart. So he had to go back to part-time before he could come to terms with reducing his hours, because suddenly, you know, he was important in his workplace and suddenly he wasn't needed anymore. He felt like he didn't have a purpose.
I'd retire, I'd still be working, as in part-time work. I've seen too many people rust. They just don't know what to do, and the wives just get absolutely, they crack it. They just hate the husband being home, or vice versa.
Well, I think it's still a changing world, and I think all the modern technology is changing every day, and I think the good times and the slow pace of life has changed forever.
I'm taking so much medication at the moment. I've grave misgivings about the future.
I think when people talk about an ageing population, they often talk about it in a negative way. But an ageing population also brings lots of opportunities.
You know, super funds as big owners or increasingly large owners of assets like retirement villages and aged care facilities could make that part of the mix.
We're going to have a lot more people who want a lot more services, and they're going to be new services, things that we don't have right now. So it's not always that we need to look at an ageing population in a negative way.
One of the things that governments may not have realised is that now that when people have retired now, they have 5 or 6 elections that they vote in after they've retired. People used to retire at 60 and they'd die at 65. They might have been lucky to get 2 elections to vote in, so they really weren't a force. But because we're living longer now, we are in a position where we do have more power than what we used to have in the past, and there's more of us.
On the internet it says there's only one other country that has a fund or a funding system that's called superannuation. That's Trinidad and Tobago, which is a little bit odd. But other countries have had other arrangements, some of them with some similarities to our own. A critical point was reached in 1992 where essentially a government had to make quite an important decision. Do we go down the track which Australia and New Zealand had pioneered at the beginning of the 20th century of building up a government response to the problem of the ageing population and the need to have funded arrangements for the financial subventions necessary for people as they grow older? Or do we set up the diversity of private sector organisation? And with the superannuation guarantee came the promise of a multitude of private sector organisations, largely built on the union movement with representatives and the trustees from the union and employers' organisations, with the century-old history of that type of arrangement in Australia. And it's a remarkable thing that in the space of the 20 odd years since then, that such an enormous fund has been established for the betterment of the people of Australia. And I was really proud to sit with Mavis and Angela last night, and they are a source of the knowledge of the history of this industry. And I tell you, if you haven't already done it, you've got to sit them down. If necessary, the National Library will do this, and record the history. You must have oral history whilst people are still around to tell the story, the unique Australian story of how we got $1 trillion together for the funded and guaranteed benefit of the citizens of this country. So I think you should certainly get to that and not delay it. I want to propose to you today that a good society, a civilised community, will be democratic, and that involves not just protecting the rights of majorities, about which democracy is pretty good, I mean, you don't go through a day now, but you pick up the Australian and you see what some latest poll has said, and they have graphs of where Mr Rudd is and where Mr Abbott is. This is a feature of majoritarian democracy, but a good society and a civilised community will protect its vulnerable minorities. And I want to suggest to you that, generally speaking, Australia has, in its democracy, muddled through to solutions that do that. I had my first inkling of this when I was a boy of 11. At that time, my grandmother had remarried, this is my father's mother, and she had married a communist. Now, back in 1951, that wasn't a good career move, but he was not only a communist, but he was actually the treasurer of the Australian Communist Party. His name was Jack Simpson. He was a New Zealander. He'd fought at Gallipoli. He was an idealist. He'd been raised as a Catholic. He threw away that religion and he embraced communism as another religion. And the Menzies government had just come in with a mandate from the people to ban the Communist Party and to take away their civil liberties. And the case was challenged in the High Court of Australia, the court on which I was later to serve. And as a little boy, I knew that there was this institution far away which was going to have a decision which would affect my Uncle Jack, as I called him. And he had his bags packed. Strangely enough, he was coming to Queensland. He had probably the moolah of the Communist Party in his suitcases to flee the effects of the Communist Party Dissolution Act, but the High Court, as you know, struck down the validity of the Communist Party case, and in effect the court said, in this country you can deal with people for what they do, for the antisocial things that they do, but you can't deal with them for what they believe or what they think. And it was interesting that a lot of Christian and other religious people supported the opposition to the Communist Party legislation, and when subsequently a referendum was held, the Australian people, with their great wisdom, refused to agree to change the constitution to overcome the High Court decision. And in 1992, at the same time as Paul Keating and others with Mavis and Gary and other people were working towards the superannuation guarantee, another extremely important decision was made by the High Court of Australia. I wasn't a member of the court at the time, so I can neither take the credit or the blame. But this was the decision in the Mabo case, because another vulnerable group in Australia was the Indigenous community, the Aboriginals, Torres Strait Islanders. And on British settlement, a theory had been established by the lawyers, by the courts, by the Privy Council, that Australia had been an empty continent with uncivilised nomads, and that the Crown had taken possession and that the Aboriginal people had no native title to their land. That was the theory that lasted 150 years. Let it be said that no Australian elected democratic parliament changed that theory. The democratic system didn't really operate because this was an unpopular, or at least disrespected minority. But the High Court, by reaching to principles of international law, concluded that you could not, in 1992, have a principle of Australian common law that disrespected the land rights of a proportion of the people simply on the basis of their race. And that was the foundation, the essence of the Mabo decision. And it was reached in 1992. And it was another important decision that confronted a vulnerable minority's rights and upheld the entitlement to equality in treatment and to dignity and respect as members of the Australian community. There are, of course, other minorities, the refugee applicants, who come in relatively small numbers. I mean, in comparison with the flows of refugees that come across land to Europe, We have but a trickle in Australia, but there's something in the psyche of our country because of the fact that we're an island. Island people tend to be very suspicious of those who come across the seas. I mean, we may sing about it, we even did last night, of those who come across the seas when Mr. Rudd came into our presence. But those who come across the seas to Australia haven't always been welcomed. And the refugees have refugee applicants have quite often had a bad time. And so, as we all know, until it was finally abolished in 1996, did those who confronted the White Australia policy. We were very suspicious of anybody who didn't look pale like us. And that was something that was only corrected in the 1960s. But one minority, which is relevant to your industry, is one that I know well, and it was mentioned by Colin in his introduction in relation to myself. And this is the so-called GLBTIQ community: gay, lesbian, intersex, bisexual, and queer. Now, as an old fogey, I find it hard to use that word queer, but I'm getting used to it because you've got to have some sort of a description. But let's say the gay community. Based on what I consider to be misinterpretations of holy texts, attitudes had been adopted, both in society and in law, to denigrate and even criminalise people who had a same-sex attraction. And this was just part of our society. It was what I was taught when I was a young law student going to the law school. And this was just the nature of the society I grew up in. You were told, you didn't quite work out why, but you were told you had to be thoroughly and completely and eternally ashamed of yourself. And that led to legal disadvantages, such as the criminal laws against gay men, and also economic disadvantages, which affected, as it happened, me. I was approaching the end of my glorious judicial career, and the fact was that though my partner was coming to the dinners with the Queen and functions with the Governor-General and occasions at the High Court, he wasn't covered by the Judicial Pension Act. This is an act of the Federal Parliament of 1968, which is designed to give judges a pension. I'm not a really good investment for your industry because I've got this big fat Commonwealth pension. But my partner wasn't protected as an opposite sex partner would be, either as a married partner or as a de facto partner of a judge. He was just left out of the cold and was a non-person so far as post-retirement life was concerned. And representations were made to Mr. Howard and his government to change that law, and dark mutterings were expressed about how difficult it would be to get it through the federal parliament and how it was not a priority. And it is to the credit of the Rudd government when it came into office that one of the things that was done in the first year of the government was not only to fix up the Judicial Pensions Act, but to fix up 100-odd federal statutes with financial disadvantages against homosexual people. And that is a significant achievement. It doesn't affect all that many people. Some gay people go on about 10% of the population. I don't believe that. I'm more inclined to think with Dr. Kinsey that it's about something like 4% of the population is throughout life exclusively homosexual in orientation. But whatever it is, if it's 1%, it's still a proportion of our citizens, and it's a proportion of our citizens entitled to equality under the law. The interesting thing for me to observe is how in the space of the last few years we've fixed up the issue of money. Money, it seems, is negotiable, but the issue of dignity and equality and mutual respect is somehow not. And enactments were passed during the former Parliament for the purpose of preventing any recognition of same-sex relationships. As Colin Tate has mentioned, my partner has put up with me for 41 years, and I'm still to have somebody, a fellow citizen of this great and fair country, come up to me and try to explain to me how our relationship and an acknowledgement of it and respect for it by fellow citizens, not only in money terms, but in terms of social worth and utility to society, how recognising that would in any way impinge adversely on the relationships of heterosexual people. I just don't see the logic. But the financial situation is fixed up. As it happened, as you'd realise, my partner, who's the same age as I am, lost his age pension. And so he says he's in a worse position. He's got to wait until I perish. And so I'll go home tonight, and there will be Johan and Sheba the cat, and they'll both be looking at me to see how long I'm going to last and when I'm going to fall off the perch, and then they will inherit the Judicial Pension Act. But I'm not planning to do that anytime soon. Now, the particular focus of your industry, of course, is another vulnerable group in our community. Communists, gays, Aboriginals, refugees, the aged. And the aged are increasingly with us, as we all know. And the chief focus of your conference, naturally enough, has been on issues relating to increasing the fund, increasing the income, increasing the contribution, suggesting the increase from 9% to 12% or ultimately 15%. And I understand how important that all is. If Mr. Howard had moved to a 15% increase, we would have $2 trillion now available, and that would have helped to overcome the particular problem that is presented by the prospect of the increasing numbers of the baby boomers who, having joined the system late, will not have the same support of self-funded or partly self-funded superannuation to see them through their years ahead. I must say I thought that was a very good point on that introductory video, which I'd never heard of or thought of before, that most of the older people now are going to have 4 or 5 federal elections in their lifetime. I think that's an extremely important point because it does reflect upon the increasing voting power of the older members of our community with the growing cohort. But I want to mention 3 particular aspects of the ageing population in Australia, which are brought out by recent inquiries and research. The first relates to the proportion of Australians who are now living alone. This research was done by David DeVos and Professor Sue Richardson last year, and it reveals a very interesting statistic of the increasing number of our fellow citizens who are now living alone. In 1946 in Australia, it was 8% of the adult population. And at the same time, in the US and the UK, it was 9%. The English-speaking countries have roughly the same percentages on this, including the same changes in percentage. In Scandinavia, the average was 16%, so it was about double our rate, even back there in 1946. But at the 2006 census, the number of Australian adults living alone had risen to 27%, in the UK and the US the same, and in Scandinavia 40%, and in Sweden 46% of adults live alone. This isn't confined only to older members of the community. It is a statistical trend that is affected by changing patterns in fertility, by different patterns of longevity, by higher divorce rates and higher proportions of people who never marry, and by, according to the researchers, the greater proportion of women who have education. But age is a factor. Of all widows in the Australian population in 1986, which isn't all that long ago, 24%, a quarter, were over 80. But by 2006, the last census, 42% of all widows were over 80. 42%, which shows the big shift as the population has aged in the increase in the number of widows at that time. Gender is certainly a factor in living alone, and interestingly, the research of Professor Richardson and Dr. De Vos suggests that there are two fundamental cohorts involved here. One is younger men who are divorced or never married, and most of whom are on lower income or with a poor educational background, and older women, most of whom have a better educational background. And the conclusion that these very distinguished researchers for the Academy of Social Sciences have said is this: in summary, living alone continues to be a popular and growing living arrangement. The living alone population is diverse and changing. Its character changes as the characteristics of the wider population change, thus the rise in divorce, the baby boomer population, better health, improved education, changing opportunities for women have altered the profile of the living alone population over at least the last 20 years. The living alone population is highly gendered. And they go on to conclude, is living alone being driven by population ageing? Not really. Is living alone a reflection of increasing affluence? Partly. Is living alone a reflection of marginalisation and disadvantage? Yes, partly. And if in your industry you think both of the changing features of the aged population, of the higher expense that is involved and greater risks that are involved in living alone, and if you think of the target groups at whom you should be addressing your advertising and endeavours to bring people into the superannuation system, then the living alone factor is obviously one to be considered. A second matter, and it's not unrelated, is the issue of housing and also the issue of elder abuse. Just as there is child abuse that gets a great deal of attention, elder abuse exists and it doesn't get attention, rather like child abuse didn't get attention until quite recently. This issue is examined in a report of the Federal Parliament, Older People and the Law, in 2007. It shows that there's an increasing cohort of the total population who are over 65, and it's now 12% of our population, and suggested that by 2050 it'll be 26%. And the intergeneration report said that by 2020 there are going to be 12,000 centenarians in Australia, 12,000 people of or over the age of 100 by 2020, which is only 10 years away. My father, I hope, is going to be one of them. My father is 94. He is still sharp as a tack. He's still driving carefully, and you've got to get every 2 years, you've got to get a test for it. And he's still cooking a meal for such of his children who'll turn up on Sunday nights every Sunday. So this is a feature of our ageing population. Living arrangements are quite interesting. My father lives on his own in the family home. But the stereotype that old people are all living in assisted accommodation is not correct. That constitutes a cohort of only 6% of the population over 65, whereas the population living in private dwellings is 77%. So that is an indication of the way in which older people are living, and often, as in my father's case, I think it's fair to say, they're capital rich but income poor. The rest of the population outside the assistance accommodation and private dwellings are living in retirement villages, rental and shared accommodation, including caravan parks, public and community housing, and in the case of 250,000 of our fellow citizens in Australia, they are homeless, and especially amongst Indigenous populations where there are very high percentages of homeless old people. Abuse is, on the research, the result of intimate private relationships, generally where the people involved are both under stress from a financial viewpoint. The percentage of those in aged care who are subject to abuse is estimated at about 4%, those living in the community at about 3%, and 90% of such abuse comes from family members or from other persons who are involved in their immediate vicinity. Now, an issue for your industry is, do you simply write off this problem? Do you say, well, we're not really concerned about this problem because these are not, in the nature of things, people who are going to be investors in superannuation and subject to our industry? We can't cure all the problems of the world, and this is just a problem that government has to fix. This is a safety net problem. It's not a problem for us. But if you look at your industry in the context of the entire whole of life decisions that have to be made for vulnerable older people, then surely there is a reason why your industry should be concerned with elder abuse and with the living arrangements and with the needs of the people in the community who are amongst the vulnerable old. And the third and final cohort that I want to mention relates to healthcare. In mental health, this conference heard yesterday from John Mendoza of the very large suicide rates, especially amongst men in Australia, underestimated at 2,500 each year. This may be connected with issues such as abuse in cases of older suicides and of lack of housing. And the Rudd government has made a goal to halve the quarter of a million people who are homeless in Australia by 2020. And this is an admirable goal, and it's connected with mental health reform. It's connected with alcoholism. It's connected with premature ageing, which affects men especially who are over 55, and in the case of Indigenous populations, men and women who are over 45. The Commonwealth White Paper proposed the expenditure of $1.2 billion in securing this reduction from 250,000, but the delivery of the services is reportedly held up by decisions that have to be made by COAG, the Committee of Government, Commonwealth and State Governments, and the usual federal problem has arisen in the delivery of those services. But I hope it can be achieved, and it must surely be one of the efforts of this industry to encourage respect for all members of the aged population, and in particular those who suffer mental health and housing problems. Physical health is definitely on the agenda. I was in Paris last week for the OECD, and the newspapers were full not only of the stories of President Obama's difficulty in getting through his health package, but also of the stories of the Greek pension problems, which were said to be related to the financial difficulties of the Greek government, but also Mr. Brown making a late run to confound the pundits and to get re-elected as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He has promised free aged care, which would not be means tested, if he is re-elected to government. This is highly controversial, and it's attacked by the Conservative opposition, saying it ought to be funded in part at least by taxpayers, as in the Netherlands, but it will be interesting to see how that plays out. President Obama's particular problem has been somewhat different. Hidden away in the complex legislation, a huge package of legislation, which has been one of the criticisms of it, comparing the Civil Rights Act that President Johnson got through Congress, which was a 5-page statute. President Obama's statute is like the collected chapter of Bob Hawke, which we were shown last night. It's a huge piece of legislation. But hidden away there, you wouldn't believe this, was a little provision that provided for the giving of end-of-life counselling and care for older people. And that was hit upon by Sarah Palin. You may have forgotten her. She was the running mate of for the presidency of John McCain. And Sarah Palin found this provision, and she immediately said, these are death panels, and these are panels to decide whether American citizens live or die. In Australia, we have 61% of people of my age dying in hospital. But if you get past the barrier of 75 and you're in the cohort with my father, only 27% of people at the age of 90 die in hospital. Most of them die at home, and when they go to hospital, they're in there for very short periods, and the heroic efforts that are made to resuscitate and save youngish people like myself of my age are simply not endeavoured in the hospitals. But there isn't a provision in Medicare for end-of-life counselling, and one suspects that many of the decisions that are made by medical care at the age of 90 are without full, at least full overt discussion with patients. And maybe that's something that your industry should also think of, because of the principle of patient consent and patient involvement in end-of-life decisions. The final point I'd like to make is this. If you look at our democracy, and if you look at the categories of disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, including the aged, of whom one only are the aged population of our country, then the issue is, how can we make our democracy more responsive to these vulnerable groups? We have inquiries, we have elections, we have commitments, but it isn't always the case that the disadvantages and injustices suffered by minorities, particularly if they're suspected or unpopular minorities, are well looked after. And that's why in the inquiry into the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms in Australia, conducted by the committee headed by Professor Frank Brennan, that's why amongst the most numerous submissions made to it were submissions on behalf of the ageing population and representative bodies of aged Australian citizens, suggesting that better protection of rights could be secured if we had a national Charter of Rights. Well, you would have seen in the newspapers that the newspapers don't like this, the media don't like it at all. One sometimes wonders if that's because this would be a means of bringing their instances to the attention of the independent courts, which are probably the only arm of government in Australia that never buckles to media pressure. But also some older politicians, Mr. Carr springs to mind, go around saying, we don't need this, this is just going to be elected judges taking over the responsibilities of the elected parliament. But nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at actually what the Brennan Committee proposed, it is a proposal for a national civil rights charter which would be similar to that which is in force in New Zealand and in the United Kingdom, which are societies not all that different from our own. And the object of the Brennan proposal is far from taking away the powers of the parliaments, a measure to increase the attention of Parliament to instances of injustice and inequality to vulnerable groups and people. The scheme of the legislation is that persons who consider that their fundamental rights have not been respected can go to court and measure the governmental action against the principles of the Charter, and if the judges consider that a breach of the Charter has been established, then the judges draw that to the notice of Parliament. They make a declaration. They don't strike down the law, they don't give money, they don't give any other relief, they make a declaration. And the object of that is to try to make the parliaments themselves respond, to stimulate the parliamentary process. You can stimulate the parliamentary process by lobbyists. They're very expensive, but sometimes effective. You can stimulate it by having very big dinners with politicians and very big lunches where tables are spent and paid for very large sums. But little folks often find it very hard to stimulate the legislative process. And the object of the Brennan report and of the Charter proposal is to provide a means by which courts could stimulate the process on the application of people who contend that a Charter right has been infringed. If we look at our country, I think we can say we normally get there, but sometimes it takes a very long time. In the case of the Judges' Pensions Act, it was just in time, just before the end of my judicial service. And it is sometimes useful to have a way of ensuring that the community addresses not just the needs of the majority, but also the needs of the vulnerable minority. And I hope that your amazing and extraordinary industry, about which I really was relatively ignorant, as I suggest most Australians would be, that your industry can become involved in the debate about a national human rights charter. The issues of protecting the vulnerable are issues that test our society, and especially in the not-for-profit sector of the superannuation funds. There is a high idealism, and there is the moral principle of John Wesley, of which we've been reminded at the opening of today's session. And I hope that those principles will guide your industry and your funds in the years ahead. And important though the issues of finances are, and correct that they should be discussed, and correct that you should consider investment in the carbon area, the climate change and so on, spare a thought for those who are more vulnerable and who don't get into your industry, and work out ways in which you can attract and serve increasing numbers, because the numbers will increase in the years ahead. Thank you very much.